The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. In the heart of Indiana, where silence fills the gray corridors of death row, every ticking second counts down to the end. These walls have witnessed the final breaths of men who once walked free. Killers, fathers, sons, all facing the same steel fate. Their last meals were simple. Their final words, haunting. And in their last moments, the line between guilt and forgiveness blurred into silence. This is not fiction. These are real records. The documented final meals and last words of Indiana's executed prisoners. Each story revealing what a man chooses when he knows it's over. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The crimes that led to death row. Before the final meals and last words were written into history, these men were ordinary. Some were raised in broken homes. Others grew up in small Indiana towns, where trouble started with petty crime and ended in blood. This is how they found their way to death row, through choices that led to no return. Gregory Risnover, the man who fought back. In 1980, a quiet Indianapolis neighborhood turned into a war zone. Gregory Risnover and his accomplice, Earl Risnover, had been involved in a shootout with police after a warrant was issued for their arrest. Gregory, known for his defiant spirit and deep ties to street life, refused to surrender. When officers surrounded their home, bullets tore through the walls. Officer Jack Orberg, a respected Indianapolis policeman, was fatally shot during the exchange. The standoff lasted hours. By the time it ended, Gregory was wounded and arrested. At trial, the courtroom was tense. Reporters filled the gallery. Gregory sat expressionless, tattoos visible along his arms, showing his affiliation with a local gang. Prosecutors painted him as a man without remorse, someone who'd rather die fighting than give up. He was sentenced to death in 1983 for the murder of Officer Orberg. Despite multiple appeals, Gregory never escaped the shadow of that night. Those who saw him on death row said he carried himself like a soldier, quiet, proud, and ready for whatever came next. Voice lowers. When he spoke about the shooting years later, he didn't deny his role. He simply said, "I was born fighting. That's how I'll die." Darnell Williams, a robbery turned double murder. In 1986, a robbery in Gary, Indiana spiraled into tragedy. Darnell Williams and his friend, Roosevelt Green, had planned what was supposed to be a quick break-in at the home of an elderly couple, John and Henrietta Overstreet. The Overstreets were known in the neighborhood. Churchgoers, peaceful, generous people. That night, when Williams and Green entered their home, things went wrong. Shots were fired. Both John and Henrietta were killed. Police found evidence linking Darnell to the scene within hours. Fingerprints, spent shells, and stolen property traced to his girlfriend's apartment. During interrogation, he admitted being present but claimed Green pulled the trigger. The court didn't buy it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before handing down a death sentence. On death row, Darnell was described as restless but composed. He read religious books and occasionally wrote letters to his mother. When asked if he regretted the robbery, he said quietly, "We went in for money and came out with death. It never leaves your head." Years later, during interviews before his execution, Darnell maintained his faith, saying he'd found peace even if the world never forgave him. Stephen Judy, the killer without fear. Few names in Indiana's criminal history provoke as much horror as Stephen T. Judy. In 1979, Stephen was only 20 years old when he picked up a woman named Terry Chasteen and her 3 children along a highway near Mooresville. He raped Terry, then drove the children, ages 2, 4, and 5, to a nearby bridge. He tied them up and dropped each one, alive, into the river below. It was one of the most disturbing crimes the state had ever seen. At trial, Judy showed no emotion. He confessed openly, saying he didn't want his lawyers to defend him. He told the court he was ready to die and didn't want appeals. The judge asked him directly, "Do you understand what that means?" Judy replied, "Yes, sir. I've lived enough." He became the first man executed in Indiana after the death penalty was reinstated in 1977, electrocuted in 1981. Even moments before death, he remained calm, joking with guards and eating his final meal without hesitation. His case would later be studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of sociopathic detachment, the calm before death from a man without fear. Matthew Wrinkles, the man consumed by rage. In 1994, Matthew Wrinkles stormed into a family home in Evansville wearing camouflage and carrying a gun. He was high on cocaine, enraged after a bitter divorce, and convinced his estranged wife was seeing someone else. Within minutes, Wrinkles shot and killed his wife Deborah, her brother Tony Fulkerson, and Tony's wife Natalie. Their children, hiding in another room, survived. During the trial, prosecutors called it cold-blooded. But Wrinkles' defense argued he was mentally unstable and under the influence of drugs. The jury didn't see it that way. They saw a man who'd planned the attack. He'd even cut the power to the house before breaking in. Wrinkles would later appear on national TV, Larry King Live, talking about his crimes and the meaning of redemption. He said, "I was angry at the world. I lost control, and it cost 3 lives. In prison, he became a painter, creating haunting portraits that some said reflected his guilt. Yet, despite remorse, the sentence never changed. He was executed by lethal injection in 2009. Michael Daniels, the last to walk the hall. Michael Daniels' case wasn't as widely known, but his story reflected the same pattern: a crime, a trial, and the slow decay of time on death row. Convicted of killing a man during a drug-related argument in 1993, Daniels spent nearly 2 decades awaiting execution. In his final years, guards described him as quiet, often writing poetry and reading philosophy. He was the type who didn't talk much, but always looked people in the eye. Before his sentence was carried out, he wrote a short note. "No one is born a monster. The streets raise you, then the system finishes you." For many who worked in the prison, Daniels represented the other side of death row, the one where guilt and humanity coexist in silence. Voiceover, closing of chapter. These men were not the same, yet their fates converged in the same narrow hallway, the corridor that leads to the execution chamber. Each carried different sins, different reasons, and different regrets. But once the sentence was passed, time stopped meaning anything. From that point on, every meal, every breath, every memory was part of the countdown. The last meals. In the final hours before execution, food becomes something more than sustenance. It becomes a statement, a reflection of the man, his regrets, or sometimes his defiance. In Indiana's death row history, the last meal ritual reveals more than any confession. It tells us who they were when there was nothing left to hide. Gregory Risnover, Fried Chicken and Freedom. December 8, 1994. After nearly 14 years on death row, Gregory Risnover woke up to his final morning at Indiana State Prison. Guards said he was calm, too calm. When asked what he wanted for his last meal, he paused for a long time, then said quietly, "Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, a salad, and a Coke." Simple, Southern, familiar. To some, it was unremarkable, but to those who knew him, it made sense. Fried chicken was the kind of meal he'd grown up eating with his family on Sundays before his life fell apart. He ate slowly, talking with one of the guards about his mother. He didn't finish the meal. Half the chicken and most of the potatoes were left untouched. When asked if he wanted anything else, he smiled faintly and said, "Freedom, but I guess that's not on the menu." A few hours later, he was led to the electric chair. Witnesses said he looked straight ahead, not afraid, just done. Darnell Williams, a feast of regret. Darnell Williams, executed in 2007, made one of the more detailed meal requests in Indiana's records. He asked for a large pepperoni pizza, a chocolate cake, a 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola, and a pack of cigarettes. But what stood out most was what he didn't ask for: utensils. He wanted to eat with his hands. The guards noted how he laughed a little as the meal arrived. It was a strange moment of normalcy. Pizza and cake under death row lights. He shared a few slices with another inmate through the bars, saying, "Might as well eat together one last time." Before midnight, the food tray was cleared. He'd eaten nearly everything except one slice of pizza, untouched, cooling under the light. Later, in his final statement, he said, "That was good. Tell them I appreciate it." Simple words, but they stayed with the prison staff who heard them. Stephen Judy, no appetite for mercy. Unlike most inmates, Stephen Judy refused the last meal tradition. He told the warden he wasn't hungry. When pressed, he said, "Save it for someone who cares. I've done what I've done." Still, prison policy required that food be prepared, a courtesy that has become part of the ritual. The kitchen made him a plate of steak, potatoes, and salad. He never touched it. Instead, Judy asked for coffee and cigarettes. He smoked quietly in his cell, looking through the bars as guards passed by. One officer later said it was like watching a man stare into nothing. Not angry, not scared, just hollow. Before dawn, as the team escorted him to the electric chair, Judy joked, "You guys should charge tickets for this." That was his humor, sharp, dark, and unsettling to the end. He died with an empty stomach and an unapologetic smile. Matthew Wrinkles, the family dinner that never happened. When Matthew Wrinkles received his last meal request form in 2009, he didn't ask for anything extravagant. He wrote, 2 cheeseburgers, fries, a slice of pie, and milkshake. But before the kitchen could deliver it, he asked the warden for something unusual, to eat in his cell with his family present. It wasn't allowed. Death row rules were strict. So instead, he ate alone. Guard said he placed the food on his tray and looked at it for nearly 20 minutes before taking a bite. He told one officer, "I used to eat burgers with my kids. This feels like that, except without them laughing." He finished only half of the meal. The rest stayed untouched, like a quiet offering to memory. Later that night, as he prepared for execution, Wrinkles thanked the kitchen staff for trying to make it normal. They said he seemed more concerned about them than himself. Michael Daniels, the poet's last plate. Michael Daniels, who spent more than 20 years awaiting execution, approached his final day differently. He'd spent years studying religion and philosophy, and his request reflected that. He asked for a single plate of fried catfish, cornbread, and sweet tea. To him, it was symbolic, food from his childhood, a last connection to where he came from. Before eating, he bowed his head in silence for nearly 2 minutes. A guard nearby said it looked like prayer, but it was quiet, no words, no movement. He took his time eating, savoring each bite. When he was done, he said softly, "I've had my fill." The tray was removed. He sat back against the wall, eyes closed. A few hours later, his name joined the list of those who'd walked the final corridor. The psychology of a last meal. Voiceover. The last meal is more than food. It's a mirror of the soul. Some men choose comfort. Others reject it. Some eat like it's their last taste of freedom. Others refuse to eat at all. Psychologists who've studied execution rituals say that the final meal gives inmates a sense of control. One last choice when every other decision has been stripped away. In that small window before death, the plate becomes a symbol of life itself. For Indiana's death row, every recorded meal tells a story, one of memory, loss, or silent rebellion. For some, the last meal was a reminder of home. For others, it was just a way to pass the time. But when the tray was cleared, the only thing left was silence and the sound of footsteps approaching the execution chamber. The final words. When a man faces death, words become sacred. In Indiana's death chamber, every execution has one final ritual before the curtain falls, the inmate's last statement. Some use it to apologize. Some curse the system, and others say nothing at all. Each voice tells us what death sounds like when it's only seconds away. Gregory Risnover, I'm Still Standing. December 8th, 1994. The final day of Gregory Risnover's life. As guards led him to the electric chair, the atmosphere inside the witness room was tense. Officials, reporters, and family members stood behind the glass, watching silently. Risnover's final statement was brief. He refused to read a written note and instead spoke directly. I stand before you a man. I fought for what I believed, and I forgive those who brought me here. He looked toward the witnesses, nodded once, and said his final words. I'm still standing. Moments later, the current surged. The witnesses said the words echoed in their minds long after the lights dimmed. To the guards who had known him for years, it wasn't defiance, it was pride. A man refusing to let death take his dignity. Darnell Williams, tell my family I love them. In 2007, Darnell Williams was strapped to the gurney in Indiana's execution chamber. His family sat behind the glass, their faces pale under the fluorescent light. When asked if he had any final words, he looked at the warden, then at his family. Tell my family I love them. Tell my mother I'll see her soon. He paused, took a deep breath, and added softly, I'm sorry for what I did. I made peace with it. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, it's time. Those were his final words. Witnesses described him as calm, eyes closed, lips moving as if praying. When the injection began, he exhaled once, slowly, and was gone within minutes. For the guards who had known him as restless and talkative, that silence was what stayed with them, the quiet after a life of chaos. Stephen Judy, I'm ready. On March 9, 1981, Stephen T. Judy became the first man executed in Indiana since the 1960s. As he was led into the execution chamber, he showed no emotion. Guards described him as eerily relaxed. Before they strapped him into the electric chair, he looked around and said, I don't hold nothing against nobody. I'm ready to die. He then smiled faintly and added, let's do it. When the switch was thrown, Judy became the symbol of calculated calm. No remorse, no fear, no hesitation. His words, cold, detached, reflected the same darkness that defined his crimes. To this day, his case remains one of Indiana's most studied examples of pure sociopathy. Even psychologists who reviewed his behavior said his final words revealed one thing: a man who never truly believed in guilt. Matthew Wrinkles, Don't Let Anger Win. On December 11, 2009, Matthew Wrinkles walked into the execution chamber wearing state-issued blue clothing. His family and the families of his victims were in attendance. Cameras captured his final moments for the record. When asked for his final words, Wrinkles looked at the glass and said quietly, I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you can find peace. He paused, then turned toward the warden and added, Don't let anger win. It destroys everything. Those words became the most quoted line from any Indiana execution. As the injection began, Wrinkles kept his eyes open. Witnesses said he mouthed the word peace before losing consciousness. His execution was later cited in discussions about rehabilitation, the rare case of a killer who seemed genuinely changed by the time death came. Michael Daniels, we all pay in the end. The final statement of Michael Daniels, recorded quietly in 2013, carried a tone of resignation. He had spent more than 2 decades waiting for this day. When asked if he wanted to speak, Daniels took a deep breath and said, To my family, I love you. To the victim's family, I'm sorry. We all pay in the end, some sooner, some later. He then looked at the chaplain and nodded. That was all. Witnesses described the room as cold, silent. The only sound was the steady hum of machinery. One guard later recalled, he didn't cry. He didn't fight. He looked at peace, like a man who'd been living his execution every day for years. Words that echo after death. Final words are supposed to bring closure. But in death row history, they often do the opposite. Some inmates seek redemption in their last breath. Others use it to protest their innocence. And a few, like Judy, embrace their fate with disturbing calm. Prison staff have said the hardest part isn't hearing the words. It's remembering them. Because once the curtain closes, those last sentences don't fade. They echo through the hallways for years, pass from guard to guard like fragments of ghosts. For many, it's those words, not the executions themselves, that haunt Indiana's death row the most. Voiceover closing, in a place where time stops, and every second feels eternal. The final words are the only proof that humanity still flickers in the darkest corners of the system. Some spoke with defiance, some with sorrow, but all of them spoke truth. Their truth before falling silent forever. The psychological calm before execution. On Indiana's death row, the hours and days leading up to execution are filled with a quiet unlike any other. There's no chaos, no shouting, no visible panic. Just men alone with their thoughts, their regrets, and the weight of choices that brought them here. This is the calm before the inevitable, a silence that is both unsettling and revealing. Gregory Risnover, Stoicism in Silence. Gregory Risnover spent nearly 14 years on Indiana's death row before his execution in 1994. Guards remembered him as unusually composed in his final days. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were deliberate. He wrote letters to family, spoke quietly with staff, and reflected on his life with a clarity that surprised those around him. Risnover's tattoos, symbols of gang allegiance, personal milestones, and years of street life, seemed to soften in that quiet. The violent man the world remembered appeared replaced by someone contemplative, almost philosophical. Prisoners often shared stories of his calm. He would sit alone in his cell for hours, reading, writing, or staring at the wall. When asked what he was thinking, he said simply, "I'm just counting the moments that matter. Everything else is noise." This calm wasn't fearlessness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a deliberate choice to take control of the only thing left, his mind. Darnell Williams, Faith as a Shield. Darnell Williams, executed in 2007, turned to religion for solace. In the days before his sentence was carried out, he met with chaplains, read scripture, and wrote letters of apology to his victims' families. Guards said he carried a small Bible wherever he went, keeping it close at all times. His final conversations weren't angry or bitter. Instead, he reflected on what he could not change, the lives lost and the mistakes made. One guard recalled a quiet moment. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk, Bible open, talking softly to himself. There was no fear in his voice, just reflection. For Darnell, calm was a refuge from guilt. Faith gave him the structure to face the inevitable, a framework to find some measure of peace in a world where forgiveness seemed impossible. Stephen Judy, detached acceptance. Stephen Judy's calm was different, cold, detached, almost clinical. Staff who observed him in his final days noted that he spoke matter-of-factly about life and death. He joked occasionally, but his humor had a sharp edge. There was no pleading, no visible anxiety, no panic. Psychologists studying Judy later described him as displaying complete emotional detachment. He spent time alone, reflecting on past choices, sometimes writing cryptic notes to prison staff and family. One message, later shared in court records, read, "I know what I did. Nothing changes that. I only have now. I choose to be still." For Judy, calm wasn't about peace. It was control, a final assertion that, even in the shadows of death row, he could dictate how he met his own mind. Matthew Wrinkles, Art as Therapy. Matthew Wrinkles' calm came from creative expression. In the days leading up to his execution in 2009, he spent hours in his cell painting. His canvases were dark, emotional, and sometimes abstract, reflecting his inner turmoil. Guards often found him quietly focused, completely absorbed in his work. Wrinkles said in interviews that painting helped him confront guilt, anger, and fear. "Why put color to canvas? I see things I can't face in words," he explained. Even in the final hours before his scheduled execution, Wrinkles continued painting, finishing one final piece and leaving it behind in his cell. It became a testament to a man trying to process years of regret and reflection in silence. Michael Daniels, Philosophy and Reflection. Michael Daniels, who spent more than 2 decades on death row, sought calm in thought. He read philosophy, poetry, and literature, often writing reflections about life, justice, and morality. In his journals, he analyzed every choice he had made, every mistake, and every moment of consequence that led him to this point. Inmates described him as quietly intense, Never loud, never disruptive. He would sit for hours in the small cell, writing or meditating, sometimes sharing passages from his readings with others. For Daniels, calm was a mental exercise. It wasn't denial. It wasn't attachment. It was preparation, a way to face what awaited with clarity and dignity, however fleeting that dignity might be. The atmosphere of death row. The psychological calm on death row isn't the same for every inmate. Some find solace in religion, some in art, some in stoic detachment. Others remain restless, trying to outrun their thoughts. But for those who face the end, calm becomes a tool, a way to reclaim agency in a place designed to strip it away. Guards and chaplains have noted that during the final days, there's a tangible shift in the environment. The usual chaos of prison, arguments, fights, loud meals diminishes. Conversations are hushed. Inmates stare through barred windows, watch distant sunsets, or sit alone with their memories. Psychologists call it a form of preparation through reflection. By controlling the mind, inmates can face what comes with a sense of personal choice, even when every other choice has been taken from them. Lessons from silence. The calm before execution is deceptive. To outsiders, it may appear eerie, almost unnatural, but it's a coping mechanism honed over years of confinement. For Indiana's inmates, silence is survival. Reflection is power. In those quiet hours, men like Gregory Risnover, Darnell Williams, Stephen Judy, Matthew Wrinkles, and Michael Daniels wrestle with guilt, fear, anger, and memory, privately, deliberately, with a focus that outsiders could only glimpse. It is in this calm that the human side of death row emerges. Not in screams, not in last-minute pleas, but in the quiet courage or resignation of men staring into the void, alone with themselves. The aftermath and legacy. When the last words have been spoken and the final meal has been eaten, the story doesn't end. The echo of death row lingers in the hearts of families, in the memories of prison staff, and in the shadows of the men who once walked these halls. The legacy of those executed in Indiana is not measured by crime or punishment alone, but by the ripples they leave behind. Regret, sorrow, and lessons the state, the victims, and society must carry. This is the aftermath. The family's love, loss, and lingering pain. For the families of executed inmates, life after death row is a strange combination of relief and grief. Take Gregory Risnover's mother. She spent years visiting her son, hoping for reprieve, praying for mercy. When the sentence was carried out, she said she felt peace and emptiness at the same time. Darnell Williams' sister described visiting his grave after execution. She spoke of anger, forgiveness, and the strange duality of feeling love for a man who had caused so much pain. Even for victims' families, the aftermath is complicated. Some feel justice has been served, but the loss never disappears. Many said they were haunted not only by the crime, but also by the years of waiting, watching, and reliving the events as the death date approached. For chaplains, counselors, and staff, the psychological toll is profound. They often witness the last moments of human life and then carry those memories for years, like shadows that never leave the corridors. Staff reflections, guarding history. Guards and prison staff become part of this legacy in ways most people never see. Those who worked on death row in Indiana recall the meticulous routines, the heavy responsibility of supervising inmates, and the quiet, tense hours before execution. A long-serving guard described it this way: "You learn to separate yourself from the person and focus on the procedure. But you can't separate yourself from the story. You remember who they were, what they did, and the words they said in their last moments." Psychologists note that repeated exposure to death row can lead to emotional fatigue. Many guards develop coping mechanisms, humor, distance, or deep reflection to handle the unique environment. In this way, the legacy of executed inmates extends beyond the cell walls. It shapes the people who survive them and the culture of the prison system itself. Public perception, debate, and reflection. Executions in Indiana sparked intense public debate. Cases like Stephen Judy's or Matthew Wrinkle's drew media attention for the cruelty of the crimes and the questions they raised about capital punishment. Some argued the death penalty was necessary for justice. Others questioned its morality, citing the long wait, the emotional strain on all involved, and the ethical implications of state-sanctioned death. For every supporter of the death penalty, there was someone who believed rehabilitation should be the focus. Discussions in newspapers, town halls, and schools often reference the final meals, the final words, and the psychological calm as evidence that even convicted killers were human, and that humanity was messy, complicated, and uncomfortable. These debates continue to shape Indiana's policies and the way society views justice, punishment, and redemption. The inmates' legacy, lessons left behind. Even in death, the men of Indiana's death row left lessons. Gregory Risnover's pride and calm reminded society that dignity can exist even in the most constrained circumstances. Darnell Williams' faith and reflection illustrated the human desire for forgiveness, even when undeserved. Stephen Judy's detachment forced psychologists and the public to confront the depths of sociopathy. Matthew Wrinkle's art provided a glimpse into the tortured mind seeking expression. Michael Daniels' philosophical journals demonstrated that reflection and understanding can emerge even in confinement. For criminologists, historians, and writers, these stories are more than crimes. They are windows into human behavior, morality, and the consequences of actions. They challenge us to understand, not to justify. Reflection on society, justice, and humanity. The legacy of Indiana's death row is both cautionary and revealing. It asks society to reflect on the balance between justice and compassion, punishment and rehabilitation, law and morality. For some, the death of these men brought closure. For others, it opened new questions. What is the value of the final word spoken? Of the last meals chosen? Of the calm that precedes an inevitable end? Each story reminds us that justice is never simple, and humanity is never absolute. The passage of time, memory, and history. Decades later, the corridors of Indiana's prisons continue to hum with the weight of history. Visitors to the site of the state's former death row report a quiet intensity, a sense of lives and stories embedded in the walls. Books, articles, and documentaries preserve the memories of men like Risnover, Williams, Judy, Wrinkles, and Daniels. Their names appear in criminal records, media reports, and academic studies, each one a reminder that every crime, every sentence, and every life carries consequences. And in the silence of the prison, staff say the memories linger, ghosts of men who were once fully alive, now reduced to stories, lessons, and reflections. In the end, Indiana's executed prisoners leave more than empty cells. They leave a complex legacy, a mixture of regret, sorrow, and reflection. For families, staff, and society, their stories are warnings, reminders, and questions without easy answers. The echo of last words, the imprint of final meals, and the calm of their final hours are all threads in a tapestry of human life, crime, and justice. What remains is memory, and in memory, lessons endure.